going to jump in. For me, when I'm thinking about Thanksgiving and I'm thinking about a memorable meal, right? A memorable meal, a meal that I remember. I think there's 4 things that are required for a memorable meal. If you want to write these down in your notes. 4 things that are required for a memorable meal. One is the host, right? You can't necessarily have a big memorable meal without somebody putting to work and organizing it. So you got the host. You got the setting, like whose house are we going to, or where is this meal going to take place? You have the setting. You also have the people, right? The people. You can't really have a memorable meal without some great company. So who's the people at the table? And then 4th, the food. You can't have a memorable meal without some food, and some good food at that. So think about those questions: the host, the setting, the people, and the meal. Maybe you're wondering, well, Jason, why are you even talking about that? And I think it's important that we talk about that because we're going to see all 4 of those scenarios play out in today's story that we're going to read. Jesus, and I want to give you this experience that Jesus has with his disciples, and the backstory before we get into our at the table with Jesus, is Jesus has just sent out his disciples on a missions trip. Right? Jesus kind of said, hey, I'm sending you out to go preach and to heal. And so they did that. They went out to little towns and villages, and they went out and they were preaching what they heard Jesus preach. And they went out and they saw what Jesus did as he prayed. And so they prayed, and they came back from a missions trip that they were kind of excited. I don't know if you've ever been on a missions trip, maybe a local U.S. domestic, a local missions trip, or maybe a global trip where you got a passport, you got a visa, you got in an airplane, and you traveled somewhere else. But if you've ever been on a missions trip, when you return, there's a couple emotions that you're feeling. One of those emotions is excitement. You want to tell everybody about your experience. You want to tell them about the things that you saw, the food that you ate, the things that God did through you. You're so excited, you want to tell everybody about your experience. But not only are you so excited, if you've ever come back from a long mission trip, or if you jump time zones, or you've just been working from sunup to sundown, the other feeling you come back with is not just excitement, but also exhaustion. You just come back tired from a mission trip. Like one of those tired where you fall asleep from the airport to the house in the car, on the car ride home. Like you come back excited and exhausted. And that's kind of where we pick up the disciples today. They're excited, but they're exhausted. Look at these words from Mark's gospel. Mark says, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Remember, Jesus had sent them out, and now they're coming back, and there's that excitement. There's that level of excitement. Jesus, we want to tell you everything. They're so excited. They wanted him to hear it all, but because there were so many people kept coming and going and coming and going. Man, they didn't probably even have time to catch their breath or eat. There's just this commotion of people. So the very next verse, Jesus is kind of picking up on this, and he says, well, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. Right? Jesus kind of picks up on the idea. These guys are kind of tired, and so they need a break. I want to hear what's been going on, and so Jesus plans this trip, and they're going to hop in a boat, and they're going to cross the Sea of Galilee to a remote, desolate area, and they're going to rest with Jesus. So this is the meal, or at the table, that we're going to be exploring with Jesus and his disciples today. And maybe you're wondering, well, what does this have to do with me 2,000 years after Jesus? And that's a really good question. And here's what I would like to say to you. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these 4 books in our New Testament called the Gospels, and it's written by 4 of the disciples of Jesus that are eyewitness accounts of the life and the ministry of Jesus. And each one of them picks up on a different nuance or different characteristic, and we get a chance to kind of see it through their perspective. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all 4 Gospels all include this mealtime miracle that we're going to read today. And I think it was so important that it helps us understand who Jesus was, why Jesus came, and what Jesus desires to do in the lives of his followers. All 4 Gospels included it. It gets full coverage. In fact, I'm going to be jumping around several of those Gospels today because I want to give you a full perspective of everything that's happening at this meal, and seeing it through the lens of each of these Gospel writers helps us get a full view perspective of what's happening. And I believe it's important for us to understand who Jesus is, because we often make a false belief of who Jesus is based on what we're feeling at the moment, or what we feel God did to us or let us down. And when we do that, we tend to veer off track from our faith and our trust in Christ. And so today's an opportunity for us to enter into the story and to look at who Jesus is and why Jesus came and what he desires to do in the lives of his followers. And for some of us, this might be like brand new. We've never seen it this way before. And for others, this is going to be a great refresher and a reminder of the incredible, marvelous love that your Father and your Savior, Jesus Christ, has for you. So let's look at these 4 elements one more time of what makes a meal a memorable meal. Remember, we have the host, we have the setting, we have the people, and we have the meal. So let's jump into the first one. Let's talk about the host. The host. I'm talking about the host today, and I don't know who plays host in your life when your family gathers together. Maybe it's at a parent or maybe a grandparent, and they have the home and everybody goes there, and they're the party planner. They've been organizing this since last year's Thanksgiving ended, and they've kind of sent out the menu, and they've asked people to do different parts of it. But Jesus happens to be the host in our story today, and we pick up in Mark chapter 6. And it says, and they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Remember, Jesus is like, hey, I want to hear what's going on. You're tired. Let's go somewhere where we can rest. And here we go, because there's a wrinkle in the story. And this is where things kind of get interesting. It says, now many saw them going and recognized them. And they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Here's what's happening. There are people who wanted to be with Jesus so bad that they literally booked it around the lake and beat them there, right? So Jesus and his disciples are in a boat and they're crossing the Sea of Galilee, and there's people that are like, we want to be with Jesus. And so they start running, and they're running, and they're running all the way around the lake, and they got to the other side when Jesus was there. They wanted to be with Jesus so bad that they're running, and as they're going through all the different towns, people are like, where are you going? And they're like, Jesus, he's going to be on the other side. And so people from all these other little towns started following and jumping in, and it was a sea of people that was on the seashore when Jesus and the disciples pulled up. It wasn't 10 or 20 or 50 or 100. We're talking about thousands, probably 10,000 people on the seashore as Jesus and the disciples are pulling up. Can you just imagine the disciples in the boat as they're rowing up to the shore, and they see the shore, what seems to be moving, but it's not moving, it's just people. And they're like, oh, people. Have you ever been peopled out? Like, I've reached my people quota. Oh, Jesus, I thought we were going to get a break. Right? And Jesus is like, me too, backing up the boat, beep, beep, beep. No, but this is the cool story, because this is where we get to find out what kind of a host Jesus really is. Because if you've ever been a host, you know that there's sometimes unexpected surprises, and sometimes those unexpected surprises are unexpected guests. And so how does Jesus respond to this massive crowd of people? Verse 34, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Now, this giant crowd is interrupting Jesus' plans with his disciples, and instead of getting frustrated that your plans got all messed up, instead of turning the boat around and looking for a different port, we read that Jesus had compassion on them, and he had compassion for a very specific reason. He says, because they look like sheep without a shepherd. Now, today is 2023, and we don't see a lot of flocks of sheep and shepherds moving around South Dallas. This is a little foreign to us, so I think it's important that we take a little bit of time and understand why Jesus is having compassion on this group of people and what it means to be sheep without a shepherd. So what would a shepherd provide for a flock of sheep in first century Israel? Here's 4 quick thoughts. First, a shepherd leads the flock. I don't know if you knew this or not, but sheep are rather not the brightest of animals. They don't know where to go. And it's not like in ancient Israel, there were lots and lots of roaming meadows full of grazing land. And it's not like there was safe drinking water everywhere. No, it's kind of a dry and arid place. And a shepherd knew where the grazing pastures were. A shepherd knew where the water holes were. Sheep would be lost without a shepherd taking them to life-giving nourishment. It was a shepherd's job to lead the sheep. A shepherd wasn't just responsible for leading the sheep, but a shepherd knows the sheep. A shepherd knows the sheep. In fact, the sheep also know the shepherd. I've been told that in the Middle East, where multiple shepherds gather all of their flocks at a common watering hole, that all of the sheep end up getting intermixed as they're grazing or drinking from the water. And maybe the shepherds are all kind of sitting underneath the shade of a palm tree, and they're sitting there and they're watching and they're eating their leftover Thanksgiving meal. Like, I don't know, maybe you do this already, but I'll tell you, Thanksgiving turkey is probably better when it's leftover and cold and sliced up between 2 pieces of white bread and lathered with mayonnaise, a cold turkey sandwich where you taste more mayonnaise than turkey, right? Maybe they're sitting there and they're eating their cold leftover Thanksgiving turkey sandwich, and maybe one of the shepherds finishes his meal and he kind of gets up and goes, "Hey, all my sheep, we're going." That those sheep know that shepherd's voice, and where there's multitude of sheep and multitude of shepherds, only the sheep that know that shepherd's voice will get up and move, and all the others will stay. A sheep knows the shepherd, and a shepherd knows the sheep. Here's another interesting thought. A shepherd's job is to protect the sheep. To protect the sheep. Out in the wilderness, there are wild animals who see the sheep as easy prey, and it would be the shepherd's job to protect the sheep. And not just to protect the sheep, but it's a shepherd's job to care for the sheep. If a sheep falls or gets injured, the shepherd cares for that sheep. And so when Jesus looks at the crowd that had ran ahead and beat him to the seashore just to be with him, he has compassion on them because he sees people who are alone. He sees people who are lost. He sees people who are aimless. He sees people who have no one to protect them. He sees people who are hurting. He sees people who are in pain. And I wonder if any of those descriptions resonate with you. I wonder if any of those descriptions sound like your last couple of days, or your last couple of weeks, or your last couple of months, or your last couple of years. I wonder if any of those descriptions, people who are alone, aimless, wandering, hurting, sick, I wonder if any of that resonates with you. And if it does, I want you to know that Jesus wants to be your good shepherd. We know that how Jesus feels about this crowd. He has compassion on them. But what is he going to do? Like, what does that compassion motivate him to do? Because they're there for him. How does Jesus respond now that his plans are interrupted? And I love how Jesus responds because it says in Luke's narration of this story that he welcomed them. It says he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. He doesn't shun them or push them away or say you need to reschedule for a better time. He welcomes them. And I see Jesus stepping into the role of a shepherd for these people. He steps into that role and he welcomes them. He teaches them. He leads them into truth. He cares for them. He heals their sicknesses. And I believe that Jesus desires to be a good shepherd for them and for you and for me. He even says in John's gospel, I am the good shepherd. I know my own and my own know me. Jesus knows you and he wants you to know him. Jesus is describing this kind of relationship he wants to have with his followers. He wants to be a good shepherd to us. And so I wonder if we ask the question, who is Jesus? Why did he come? And what is it that he wants to do in my life? And I believe that one of the roles that Jesus desires to have in our lives is to shepherd us, to lead us. And I wonder if you've ever thought about Jesus in that way. And I wonder if you've ever given Jesus permission to lead you in that way. So as we're talking about a memorable meal today, we have a wonderful host in Jesus. But it's important that we also understand the setting. Let's look at the setting for just a minute where this meal is taking place. When Jesus and the disciples step off the boat, they're near the town of Bethsaida. And there's something that you need to know about this area of Israel, and it has a reputation for being a zealot territory. And you might be thinking, well, what's a zealot? And that's a great question, because the Zealots were a political movement in first century Israel that sought to incite the people to rebel against Rome and to expel them by force. It was the beginning of this kind of civil war where Israel wanted to get rid of Roman rule. And Jesus is now in Zealot territory, and this movement is starting to pick up steam. And if you're thinking, I don't know about that. That sounds a little far-fetched, Jason. Then check out this scene from the Gospel of John as John narrates this miracle meal, and see how John closes up the story. John writes, perceiving that they were about to come and take him, speaking of Jesus, by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain. They wanted to make Jesus their military ruler. They're like, nah. We don't want any of that good shepherd stuff. We want a military ruler who's going to get rid of Rome. They wanted to make him king by force, and Jesus knew it. They're not actually listening to the teachings of Jesus. They're only interested in what Jesus could do for them or be for them. They've pre-decided who Jesus is, and they pre-decided what kind of role they wanted Jesus to fulfill. And I wonder if that's something that we do also. Do we pre-decide what kind of Jesus we want him to be based on what we're needing, or do we pre-decide what kind of Jesus is based on what's happening in our lives? I wonder if some of us look at the teachings of Jesus in the Bible and we pre-decide that Jesus is a little old-fashioned. So we pre-decide that, well, Jesus, that might have been fine then because culturally that was fine, but culture's progressed. We've been enlightened. We've moved along. We're not there anymore. And so we don't have to follow some of the rules of the Bible and some of the things that Jesus taught his disciples because we pre-decided Jesus is going to wink at our sin and it's going to be okay for us. We pre-decide what Jesus is going to be, what he accepts and what he doesn't. I wonder if we pre-decide that maybe if you got some mistakes in your life or you got some failures of your past, I wonder if we pre-decided that, man, I don't know if Jesus has enough grace to overcome all of my mistakes and all of my past. Maybe he can save me, but surely he can't transform me enough to ever use me in the kingdom. Like I could never lead a life group. I could never serve in ministry. I could never be a prayer partner. I got too much baggage and it's too much for Jesus to overcome. What if we pre-decide that there's limits on Jesus of what he can and can't do? I wonder if we've ever tried to predetermine and decided that, there's a certain group of people that Jesus doesn't like, and because Jesus doesn't like them, then I don't have to like them. And we kind of make these assumptions or these false assumptions for Jesus. Exactly what the Zealots are doing here. They pre-decided what role they wanted Jesus to play, and I think we fall into that trap at times too. So what do we learn about Jesus and who he really is from this story? When we read a full picture of Jesus through the gospel stories, we understand that Jesus didn't come to be a pawn in anyone else's movement. He came to start a movement of his own. We don't follow Jesus to get to where we're going. We follow Jesus to get to where he's going. And the Zealots were following Jesus to get to where they were going. And I wonder if there's any area of our life where we've gotten off track, where our expectations of Jesus have begun to override the reality of who Jesus really is. And I wonder if today would be a good day to surrender some of our false expectations of Jesus and to ask God to open our heart and open our eyes to see who Jesus really, really is in what he really, really wants to do in our lives. So as we sit down to a memorable meal, we have a wonderful host in Jesus. We understand the setting. But what about the people? What about the people? I mean, the people make the gathering, right? And the original plan for Jesus and his disciples was getting away for a little R&R. And then this huge crowd shows up. And now it's getting late in the day. And it says in Luke's gospel, now the day began to wear away. And the 12 came and said to him, send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are in a desolate place. Now, I don't think the disciples are trying to be rude here. I don't think they're just trying to not do their job or responsibilities. I think they're trying to be respectable and hospitable. They're in the middle of nowhere, and logic would say Chick-fil-A's closed. And we haven't planned for this. We didn't hire a catering service. There's no place for people to rest and sleep. Like they're trying to think logically, and I think it's a reasonable request. But Jesus said to them in the next verse, you give them something to eat. So they're like, okay. Okay, 10,000 people. Let's go look at our food stash. Jesus, we got a problem. There's 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. We got a problem. And they don't know that Jesus is up to something. Jesus is up to something important here because Jesus wants to do something in and through the disciples that they don't have the capability or the resources to do in and of themselves. They don't have the physical resources. They don't have enough food to do what Jesus wants to do in and through them. And I believe that the same thing is true today for modern day followers of Jesus, that he desires to do something in and through us that we don't have the capability or the resources of doing by ourselves. So they're holding this bread and they're like, no way. It's not going to work. And Jesus says, here, why don't you bring them to me? Why don't you bring your inadequate fish? Why don't you bring your inadequate bread? Why don't you bring your inadequate selves to me? Bring them to me and watch me work. And what does Jesus do? He transforms the bread and the fish into a memorable meal for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people that will never forget this miracle meal that they had. And Jesus gives the bread, he breaks the bread and hands it to the disciples, and they go out and begin to distribute bread and fish to a multitude of people, and everyone ate their fill, and there was leftovers, like cold turkey sandwiches, leftovers. And God did something incredible in and through the disciples. And I think God still says the same thing to you and me today. Bring your inadequate selves and bring your inadequate resources to me, and I'll transform them into something beautiful. So how does this work for us? We're supposed to simply bring ourselves to Jesus. You don't have to clean yourself up and come to Jesus. You just come to Jesus. You bring your inadequate self, and Jesus is always enough. And so I don't know what Jesus is speaking to you today. Maybe there's a character flaw that you just haven't seemed to be able to overcome. Jesus says, bring your character flaw to me and let me do a miracle work in your life. I don't know if you feel challenged to be in ministry or lead a life group or mentor a high school student and you're thinking of all the reasons why you can't. Jesus says, just bring your inadequate self to me and let me do the work. Let me do the work. I think that's the role that Jesus desires to play in our lives. 4 elements to a memorable meal. You got a host, you got the setting, you got the people, and of course we got to talk about the food. We got to talk about the food. I mean, the food's the most important part of the meal. By the way, since we're talking about food, we have our annual fall party and chili cook-off tonight. We have a chili cook-off, we have a bake-off tonight, and we want nothing more than for you to be here tonight. Such a great opportunity for new people in our church family to make community and friends and family with one another. And so even if you don't have anything to bring tonight, bring yourself. We're going to have a great time tonight starting at 5 o'clock. I got up early this morning. My day is kind of full, so I got up way early this morning, and I got 2 crock pots of chili that have been going. I mean, one is a beef chili, one is a venison chili. And before I left my house, man, the aroma of all the spices and all the meat all coming together smells so good. And so I'm just letting you know, when you come tonight, vote for my chili to win. But we're going to have an incredible time, but we won't have an incredible time if you're not here, because we're going to remember that. We're like, oh, you know, that person didn't come to the chili cook-off. Yeah, them. I'm kidding. But we want you here. So what's the food at this outdoor miracle meal that Jesus is having with his disciples and a little crowd of 10,000 people? Right? There's this bread and there's this fish, and there's this powerful symbolism behind the bread in the story. And we get a little clue to the symbolism from this little random detail in John's narration of this miracle meal. And John says this kind of at the beginning of his telling of the story. And he says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And we read that and we're like, nice little random fact, John, and we keep on going. But listen, there's nothing that's random in the Bible. John puts it in the story for a very specific reason, and he wants us to connect this event where Jesus multiplies the bread with the Jewish festival of the Passover. What's the Passover? I'm glad you asked. So the Passover is a Jewish celebration of an event in history called the Exodus. Like thousands of years before Jesus, God's people were enslaved in Egypt. And God raised up a leader by the name of Moses. If you don't know the story, you can watch the movie called The Prince of Egypt. Right? Or the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. Like that's the King James version of the story. And so God raised up Moses to lead them out, and he leads them out into the wilderness. So they're walking around in this wilderness, this desolate place. And if you've ever been in a wilderness, there's no restaurants in the wilderness. And you got a couple million people walking around, and they are hungry. And John wants us to see the connection between this event and the Exodus event. So let's talk about some of the details of the Exodus event. While Israel's wandering around in the wilderness, they get hungry, and God provides manna for them, which means this heavenly bread that would just kind of fall down, rain down from heaven. Every morning they would walk out, and manna had rained down, and they would walk out, and there was like French toast and pancakes and croissants. I mean, they would walk, there was just beautiful heavenly bread every morning when they would step out of their tents. And now, in another desolate, remote place, people are hungry, and Jesus breaks some bread, and a miracle with bread appears once again. And the people in the audience are starting to go, I'm connecting some dots here, and I see what's going on. Moses led Israel out of Egypt. Jesus is going to lead us out of Roman rule. We're connecting some dots here. Look, they were in a desolate place. We're in a desolate place. They were hungry. We were hungry. God did a bread miracle. Jesus did a bread miracle. And John is saying, no, you've got it wrong. Jesus didn't come to bring you freedom from Rome. Jesus came to bring you freedom from something else. What's that something else? Well, to find out what that something else is, we have to follow Jesus and his disciples back across the Sea of Galilee, where a group of people run around the sea and meet him on the other side the next morning. And the next morning, the conversation keeps going on with all those people that ran around, and Jesus disembarks once again with his disciples, and there's a group of people, and they're like, hey, that bread, that miracle, wasn't that like manna? Wasn't that kind of cool? Are you the one that's going to lead us to freedom? And Jesus says, your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. Kind of encouraging, huh? This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. Well, that sounds intriguing to me, this whole not dying thing. So what bread? What bread do we eat so that we don't have to die? Like the bread that you just produced, that was kind of a miracle. That was kind of cool. Like the miracle bread? No, Jesus says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. You see, this miracle in the wilderness, where Jesus provides bread, is foreshadowing what he's going to do on the cross, where he gives his life away as a ransom for many. I am the bread, and if you eat this bread, you will never die. Jesus didn't come to bring freedom from Rome. Jesus came to bring freedom from death. And so what do we learn about this person of Jesus from this story? That he gave his life away to rescue you, to rescue me, and to restore us to a relationship with God that was broken in the Garden of Eden, and that you and I could spend forever and eternity with him in heaven. So as we get ready to close our service today, we have an opportunity to break bread and to celebrate communion together. We have these little communion elements that you had on your way in. There's a little bread on the bottom. If perhaps you missed it on your way in, we're going to have some of our amazing interns that jumped up, and they're going to have these available. They'll make their way up and down the aisles and just kind of wave at them, and they'll want to put one in your hand, and I want you to kind of prepare it. And you can go ahead and pull that tab at the bottom if you want to, and go ahead and get that little wafer out at the bottom. But I want to make a connection today. I want to make a connection, and I want to show you something. Jesus has this bread that the disciples had just given to him. This insufficient bread, 5 loaves. And the disciples hand this bread to Jesus. And in Luke it says, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked to heaven, he said a blessing over them, and he broke the loaves and he gave them to his disciples to set before the crowd. Is there anything about that passage that sounds familiar to you? To perhaps another story where Jesus broke bread and handed it to his disciples? It sounds a lot to me like what we call the Last Supper. Jesus and his disciples on the night that Jesus was to be betrayed. You have to fast forward to Luke chapter 22. But there, as Jesus again is at a table with his disciples, it says, and he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Today we have an opportunity to remember what Jesus Christ has done for you.